World War II was a display of carnage, blood, and cruelty. Every battle was won with a ruthless thirst for destruction. And no punishment seemed enough for those on the opposing side. The ability to inflict suffering on the enemy became the most important tactic. And there was only one limit: death. That would be the final fate for the ruthless German recruits who infiltrated the American ranks, seeking to create chaos and develop the brutal offensive in the Ardennes. These undercover Nazis were the protagonists of the worst deception of the war, and that betrayal unleashed extreme violence that would only be paid for in front of a firing squad, eager to collect the losses suffered with the same cruelty. After pulling the trigger, they would put an end to the infamous Operation Greif, one of Adolf Hitler's final blows before the fall of the Third Reich. In this new military history video, we will learn all about this incredible mission created to spread terror one last time. Join us to discover one of the bloodiest chapters of the fierce conflict. December 1944. Europe is drowning in a storm of destruction. The streets are littered with rubble and corpses. German power, which dominated the scene at the beginning of the war, is disappearing. The fierce clashes with the Soviet Union are no longer Adolf Hitler's only problem. The Normandy landing on June 6, 1944, completely changed the landscape of the conflict. The Third Reich lost thousands of men on the French beaches, their bodies abandoned, with their eyes open, staring at the sky and a horrible stench. But that was only the beginning. The devastating advance of the Western Allies was devouring the dream of a Nazi empire. The followers of the Führer continued to fall little by little, but he refused to give up. His orders remained the same: fight until the last drop of blood and finish off the enemy at any cost. They had to unleash a true hell. The German leaders' hopes were pinned on a risky plan: the Ardennes offensive. The dictator intended to round up all the men still holding out on the Western Front and send them into a brutal final battle. If he could tear through the Allied lines and divide his forces, he might be able to bring his enemy to his knees before the German troops were crushed. But if he failed, the Third Reich's army would disappear forever. However, amidst the horror, a darker operation emerged from the bowels of the Nazi machine. A task born of deceit, betrayal, and the promise of certain death for all those involved.
Hitler then began to plot one last grandstand to take advantage of the circumstances. During the Ardennes counteroffensive, Hitler expected to amass enough Nazi forces in the mountainous region in southeast Belgium and mount a counteroffensive attack against the scarcely stationed Allied forces. Hitler's ultimate goal was to cross through the Allied lines and retake the city of Antwerp and its vital port. To achieve this, he first needed to capture and destroy the Meuse river bridges, and he knew just who to call.
The plan soon became Operation Greif, and the man behind it would be Otto Skorzeny, a master of Nazi terror, capable of causing a storm of death from the shadows. His new mission was to create a brigade for the job. The Führer knew that this figure was a legend among the troops, so it would not be difficult for him to get volunteers. However, that did not mean that the task at hand was practically suicidal. It was very likely that those who joined would not return alive, and if they did, it would be with blood on their hands. Scorzeni had earned the respect of everyone for being at the forefront of operations such as the rescue of Mussolini. The Italian dictator had been overthrown in a coup d'état due to poor results in the war, and Hitler, as his main ally, ordered his men to help him. In that context, the leader of Operation Greif had been the executor of that feat that took place in September 1943, when a parachute assault allowed Mussolini to be freed and then escaped from confinement in a small plane. After his role in that mission, the SS lieutenant colonel became known as the most dangerous man in Europe. Tall and with a face marked by a scar that snaked from his cheek to the corner of his mouth, Scorzeni looked like the product of war itself. But his sinister appearance was only the preamble to his calculating mind, where deception and betrayal were the main tools. He did not care about conventional warfare. He was an expert in commando operations and raids where chaos could be turned into victory. However, Operation Greif was not just a mission to sow confusion. It also reflected the desperation of a Germany that was slowly dying, a last gasp before the Reich collapsed.
Hitler outlined his new plan for the Ardennes offensive and the role the lieutenant commander was to play in it. Scorzeni was to form a special command group, the Panzer Brigade 150, which would capture and destroy as many bridges in the Meuse River as possible before they were seized by the Allies.
When he was ordered to design and execute this mission, Scorzeni had no hesitation. This was his turf, and while he knew that Operation Greif would not bring redemption nor glorious victory, what captivated him was the ability to prolong the suffering of his enemies. In the brutal war, that was already a triumph for this ruthless character.
On October 25th, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the High Command of Nazi Germany, issued an order requesting soldiers with knowledge of the English language. Volunteers from all branches of the German military responded to the appeal. Upon arrival to what the volunteers believed was a translation-based operation, the men were questioned by Nazi officers in English. The selected soldiers for the top-secret Panzer Brigade 150 were forced to sign a pledge of secrecy, punishable by death.
Scorzeni recruited 2,500 men, many of them soldiers hardened by years of slaughter and carnage on the fronts of Europe. But many others had been called up by the Nazi Party as a last resort in the face of the loss of troops. The first thing they had to learn was not how to fight, but how to be bloodthirsty traitors. They were taught to speak English with an American accent, to use the colloquial language of the Allied fighters, to imitate their gestures, their habits, their jokes. Any incorrect word or hesitant pause could cost them their lives. The training was not a preparation for glory, but for avoiding death. For the brand new members of the 150th Panzer Brigade, hell began before the operation began. They knew that the mask they wore was not just a disguise, but a sentence. Dressed in American uniforms, wearing fake Allied insignia, and driving vehicles camouflaged to look like American tanks. The mission was to penetrate deep into the enemy front. Once there was no turning back, and if they were captured, there would be no war tribunals or prisoner camps, only bullets or hanging. The preparation was brutal. The only way to survive was to erase all trace of their origin and become the adversary. But not everything was as simple as they imagined.
After a few weeks of training, the results were less than ideal. Out of 2,500 recruited volunteers, only 400 could speak basic English, and only 10 were fluent. The non-fluent soldiers were advised to mingle with the real Americans and pretend to be too agitated and overcome with fear to speak.
This was not only a danger to the soldier who was discovered, but it could compromise his comrades or even the entire plan. The other Nazis would not forgive him if he put them at risk. So the person who stumbled while in a trench with the enemy had to beware of both American and German weapons. Death did not only come from the enemy, betrayal was always lurking in the Nazi ranks. With few fighters truly ready to face the mission, emphasis was placed on the most prepared, who were taken to American prisoner camps. For days, they were forced to walk between the rows of American inmates that the German army had captured in previous campaigns, and they were mercilessly executed to make a clear message. The well-aimed shot in the back was enough to bathe the very ground the Germans walked on with blood, as a reminder of what awaited them if they failed. There was no compassion in the eyes of their instructors, nor in those of their comrades. Every soldier knew deep down that those marching beside him would be corpses before the operation was over. Every familiar face was a picture on a coffin about to be buried. They were aware that if the enemy discovered them, there would be only one end: the announced and most brutal of deaths. Despite the promises of death, everything was ready for the great German offensive in the Ardennes. That region, with extensive forests and hills on the borders with Belgium and France, was Adolf Hitler's last and bloody chance for victory. And Operation Greif was a fundamental piece for its success. On December 16, 1944, snow covered the landscape, whose tranquility was about to be interrupted by the screams and shots of the first onslaught of the Third Reich.
German tanks and troops stormed through the Ardennes forest, and the major German push was afoot. It caught the American troops completely off guard, and a vicious battle was underway to preserve the Allied foothold in Belgium. But while the intense fighting was going on, Skorzany's fake Americans slipped through the cracks and went behind the lines to complete their mission.
The Nazis seemed to have regained their ability to unleash terror among their enemies. At every step, they left a pile of corpses that dyed the landscape red due to the blood that still flowed from their mortal wounds. Offering effective resistance became impossible for their adversaries, who did not understand the reason for the enormous disorganization among their troops. Chaos was more present than usual in the conflict. Something was happening, but no one understood it. Skorzany's commandos had infiltrated among the Allies, acting as shadows. They changed traffic signals, cut communication cables, and sabotaged ammunition depots. Their advance was slow, and as they penetrated deeper into enemy territory, the tension became unbearable. Any mistake could trigger instant death. A patrol with 3 Nazi soldiers, disguised as Americans, managed to reach the enemy's command posts. With a cold smile, the Germans exchanged greetings with officers whom they then murdered vilely after shaking hands. They knew they had one goal: to kill as many of the enemy as possible, and they did not hesitate to open fire whenever the opportunity presented itself. The corpses, torn apart by gunfire and surprise, were left piled up on the ground. Their faces were frozen in a mixture of horror and confusion. Meanwhile, for the soldiers of Operation Greif, deceit and brutality were mixed in the same act. They were no longer human. They had become ghosts of war, whose joy was to have the Americans discover their betrayal with an enemy rifle about to fire a bullet between their eyes. However, the presence of infiltrated Nazis finally became known, and with the news spreading through the Allied ranks, a new battle began within the fierce confrontation. What is striking at this point is that when the entire coalition of Western powers was alerted about what was happening, several commanders admitted that they had heard about that plan.
Now, amazingly, the Allies got word about the so-called top-secret plan, but they ignored it. They thought it was so absurd that it could only be false information intended to trick them.
As news of troops being attacked by infiltrating Germans piled up, American soldiers began to see enemies everywhere. Rumors of Nazis disguising themselves as their comrades made every familiar face a potential threat. Knowing they had been deceived generated immeasurable hatred that caused them to go on a bloody hunt for these adversaries. Security controls were tightened. Orders were issued to arrest any soldier whose identity was in doubt. Brutal interrogations quickly turned into summary trials. Any fighter who could not answer trivial questions about American culture was automatically considered an enemy. Executions became the norm, and the trenches were filled with bodies killed not for their actions but for doubt. Some bewildered by fear. Shot their own comrades if they seemed too quiet or slow to answer questions. Their hands became covered in blood, often innocent. Nothing was taken for granted anymore. With more than 200,000 Germans crossing the Ardennes forest, 3 American fighters fleeing in a jeep should not have raised any alarm. But the situation was extremely tense. A checkpoint signaled the vehicle to stop on a road in Belgium. The men in question were Charles Lawrence, Clarence van der Weert, and George Sensenbach. Or at least, that is how they presented themselves to their American colleagues who began a search. The search revealed 2 British-made Steen submachine guns, as well as several dollars and pounds in cash. Nothing seemed particularly suspicious until a deeper dialogue was established with the soldiers. Suddenly, the tension of the moment played against them. Their English became less fluent, and they made several very noticeable mistakes when expressing themselves. As if that were not enough, they were asked for a password that was being shared among the American forces. And they did not know it. That was the signal for the Americans to take their pistols and point them at the 3 men. Although the Germans tried desperately to convince them that they were colleagues, they suddenly discovered that beneath their uniforms they were wearing clothes with Nazi insignia. The farce was over. They turned out to be Sergeant Gunter Billing, Corporal Manfred Pernass, and Private Wilhelm Schmidt of the 150th Panzer Brigade. In case you still have any doubts, yes, these are 3 of the Nazis who were being brutally executed at the beginning of our video. Imagine the fear they felt when facing death, for at that moment Sergeant Billing confessed something that was still unknown. He said that one of the main objectives of Operation Greif was to infiltrate the supreme headquarters of the Allied forces. They were after the head of General Dwight Eisenhower. He was the main commander of the coalition, and the Germans had orders to kidnap or kill him. A real stab to the very heart of the enemy troops. This exploded like a bomb, and panic increased.
It provoked a complete overreaction from the American troops, bordering on paranoia. Security was tightened up beyond the pale. General Eisenhower even complained that he almost found himself a prisoner, and roadblocks were set up on nearly every road. American soldiers were instructed to question drivers of any vehicles on things only Americans would know. Things like baseball teams, movie stars, and towns. They would ask questions like, what is Sinatra's first name? Or who is the president's dog?
With controls tightened in the face of the Nazi plan to eliminate the Allied leader, Operation Greif began to collapse rapidly and brutally. Coalition forces soon began to identify and neutralize German commandos, and the General Ardennes offensive began to fail. Some of Skorzony's men, seeing themselves surrounded and with no chance of success, decided to surrender. A curious case was that of SS Captain Ernst Stielau, who surrendered to an American military policeman. He could no longer bear to live under the fear of being caught and decided to surrender before he went mad. However, the supposed American officer, who was supposed to put the handcuffs on him, turned out to be another German in disguise. In the end, both ended up becoming prisoners and disappeared from the radar. Probably, their fate was nothing more than torture and death, like that of the other traitors. Other commandos adopted desperate measures. Knowing that they had been discovered, they opted for suicide rather than fall into enemy hands. There was only one man left to find, Otto Skorzeny. He was in charge of a group of some 300 paratroopers who would seek to make a final attack on Allied headquarters to assassinate Eisenhower. He was determined to follow the Führer's orders to the very end. The mastermind behind the grand deception was hit by shrapnel from a grenade as he moved across the savage front line. He was seriously wounded in the head and was taken to a Berlin hospital. With the mission leader gone and the 150th Panzer Brigade falling apart, Operation Greif came to an end. Those who did not die in combat were captured and faced the most ruthless of revenges. The justice of the victors, imbued with spite, violence, and the desire to make the traitors pay by causing as much pain as possible. The soldiers were subjected to brutal interrogations, psychological torture, and summary executions. They were not considered prisoners, but spies and saboteurs, and the punishment for such crimes was clear: a gruesome death. Most commandos were promptly led to a firing squad. Shots rang out in front of their blindfolded eyes and their uniforms stained with deceit. As for Skorzeny, he was eventually captured by his enemies at the end of the war and taken prisoner. But in 1948, he managed to escape and settle in Spain with the help of former SS officers. The ruthless architect of the cruel betrayal lived quietly until his death in 1975 and never paid the price his men had faced. On January 25, 1945, the Battle of the Bulge ended in an Allied victory, and Nazism headed for imminent defeat. In many ways, the failed operation became a reflection of the general collapse of the Third Reich. Adolf Hitler's last hope had failed miserably. Now, after having learned the story of this atrocious and brutal deception, it is time to say goodbye. But first, we would like to know your opinion. Do you think that the covert plan could have changed the course of the war? Leave us your answer below, and thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in our next video.